Since the beginning of modern times, women have been intruding in men's spaces. It has become a predictive pattern. Once a sphere has been conquered by men, women start to sink their rapacious talons into it. Take the workplace, for instance. Before machinery and mass production, work was extremely difficult and deadly. Men performed the manual labor of farming for centuries. They built monuments and cultural wonders by hand. When settlers came to America, they conquered nature with nothing but an axe, beasts of burden, and brute strength. However, with the advent of labor-saving devices and machines of mass production, work has become safer and easier. It was at that moment when women began to enter the workforce, and they brought their sentimentality and propensity for equity with them. As a result, the workplace and the economy have paid dearly for it. Women began entering the workforce at the beginning of the 20th century, but it wasn't until the 1970s when women entered jobs en masse. Along with the safer work environments, this mass entrance by women is directly linked to the advent of the birth control pill. It wasn't long after when women declared themselves masters of their own lives. Just consider the mantras of the women's movement. A woman doesn't need a man, or as Gloria Steinem famously said, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. And in some ways, Gloria was right. The pill granted women control of their reproduction, which allowed them to break away from their dependence on men's provisioning. However, did women choose the back-breaking jobs of manufacturing, construction, or welding? Or in other words, any job which consists of manual labor? Of course not. In regards to women's workforce participation, the less physically taxing and less dangerous jobs were taken by women, such as bookkeeping, school teaching, secretaries, waitresses, and nursing. As of 2017 in the United States, there are about 74.6 million women in the workforce. That is 47% of the U.S. workforce. Here are the percentage of women's representation in selected occupations. Women are also more likely than men to have earned a bachelor's degree by the age of 29. What this means is that women are here to stay in the workplace. So what have been the repercussions to the cultural, professional, and political landscapes in the United States because most women are working? Women are fundamentally altering the way businesses hire, fire, and deal with their employees because women cannot compete with men in the free market. It is an irrefragable and empirical truth that people cannot deny. Not only are men far more physically capable than women, but there are far more men on the extreme high end of the IQ distribution. Moreover, men are more assertive. This means that men will work more dangerous and/or specialized jobs, and they will work longer hours. Thus, men will inevitably earn more money. It is as simple as that. Irrespective of the facts, feminist fallacies such as the wage gap myth and the blank slate myth get proliferated by the mainstream media, and the general public buys into these lies. Thus, we get laws and disincentives which make it more difficult for employers to fire employees, forces employers to hire or retain women regardless of their competency, and discriminate in favor of women in the workforce. I encourage you to pause the video and read these. They are the United States federal laws that operate in favor of working women. There are far more laws at the state level which I can't show because there are so many. Men, do you know where all your taxes go and why your wages remain stagnant? It's because of these laws. Women need to understand. They cannot compete, nor will they ever be able to compete, on a fair playing field with men. This fact, however, cannot be accepted by feminists and working women, because it will dismantle the feminist precept that both genders are equal in every way, physically, cognitively, competitively, and emotionally. Feminists will have to admit that they can't compete with men in the workforce, which is not an option for them, because that will mean they will have to surrender the authority that they have unjustifiably stole from men. I mentioned wage stagnation earlier. Men's wages have suffered since the 1970s because when the labor force increased, the value of labor declined. According to the Brookings Institute, a progressive social justice nonprofit organization, women's employment have helped the family as a whole, increasing the median income growth in American households. Middle-class incomes have risen only modestly in recent decades, and most of any gains in their incomes are the result of more women going to work and earning higher wages. But now that most women are employed, that source of income growth is drying up. Although women's labor force participation has rebounded after falling during the last recession, its long-term growth appears to have stalled. The female authors go on to say what really needs to be done to help boost women's earnings. Without new policies and practices that involve greater sharing of the burden of unpaid work in the home, more support for time-squeezed work families, and higher pay for both men and women, whatever growth we see in the middle class incomes may disappear entirely. There's no surprise that these two feminist writers blame the lack of public policy for stagnant incomes and women's failures, not where the blame should actually lie, which is with women themselves. In the first excerpt, the two feminist writers are correct. In a marriage, when the woman works, this will increase the level of income in the home. But those are just straight numbers. What about that which is unseen? Look at this graph. The wage increase that the middle class has experienced due to women working is only about 40%. And the bottom quintile or low class incomes are only higher than the middle class because of the government entitlement programs, which the Brookings Institute even admits. Entitlements that only exist because of the skyrocketing number of single mothers who find it almost impossible to survive financially without outside assistance. Ironic, huh? Women don't need a man, but when daddy government patriarchy offers free benefits, women are right there with their hands out. Corporations and business owners, and even governments, love the labor participation of women. As you can see from the graph, it has raised the upper echelon of income drastically because it cheapens labor, allowing companies to keep the wages stagnant. As you can see, the U.S. federal government promotes and supports women working. This is an article on the whitehouse.gov website. A large GDP means more money for politicians, so of course they will support female labor participation. Not to mention, this allows the government to raise the children of these women in government schools. Stagnant wages for men are a huge problem. When one considers the loss in value of the dollar by 96% since the creation of the Fed in 1913, wages overall have been relatively the same since the 70s because our purchasing power has decreased. Also consider this. This graph, which is from the U.S. Census Bureau, shows that men's wages have hardly budged or in some cases decreased from the 1960s to 2005. Concurrently, women's wages have steadily increased. So was the Brookings Institute correct? Has women's presence in the workforce truly helped the median household income of families? I would say no. The mediocre increase in household income is offset by the rate of dollar inflation due to the prodigious increase in government subsidies for single mothers, as well as the added cost families incur as a result of wives going to work, i.e. daycare, housekeeping, etc. Not to mention non-financial costs such as the constant tension in the household when both parents come home stressed after working all day and rush to get things done around the house before going to bed. Another repercussion of women going back to work? It renders men's provisioning less important. Prior to the sexual revolution, women had to rely on men for provisioning and security. Jobs were more dangerous, and before modernity, the world was more dangerous. This placed men in control. We had authority and value. However, modern advances in the workplace, as well as the birth control pill, have afforded women the freedom to earn their own money. Women can provide for themselves without men. This renders men's biological imperative to provide for women inconsequential. Thus, coupled with the pill, women are able to remain single and date frivolously for years. This has turned the sexual marketplace on its head. It has given women the authority that was once men's, although responsibility that should go hand in hand with authority is still men's burden. This has made men second-class citizens. A woman wants their husband or partner to make more than them. This fact makes feminists very mad. Feminists decry when men earn more, but when the rubber meets the road, women are more likely to break up with their significant other if he makes less. Women entering the workforce has also allowed them to eschew the responsibility of their most important biological imperative, child rearing. Since the 70s, women have been dumping their kids in daycare and public schools. This has created generations of state-raised children who have not been taught how to think but what to think. The United States public schools are modeled after the late 19th century Prussian model of education, whose primary goal was to create compliant soldiers and diligent factory workers for the country. The U.S. public schools succeeded in that. We have generations of people who are unable to think critically, as they spout mainstream talking points. They are unskilled and tend to take menial factory jobs or service sector positions, struggling to pay rent and their crippling university debt. I don't think it is a coincidence that these pro-communist Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots are occurring now as the millennial and Gen Z generations are becoming politically active. They are the children of government schools, the army of the single working mothers, lost souls who were never given a sense of purpose and never educated on the virtues of Western civilization. They were taught to hate achievement. They were taught to hate the Western way of life. Now look at what we have inherited. Women just had to attain that career and work as a man does. And the price of that are lost generations, a riotous population, and a decaying culture. The Me Too movement, which created controversy a few years ago, is a perfect example of the issue with men and women working together. Men can be crude, honest, rowdy, and aggressive, and these traits tend to manifest at the job site. Men once possessed the license to be men at the workplace. This freedom is conducive in creating camaraderie and a less stressful and more efficient working environment. However, since women have entered the workplace, men are prohibited from acting in such ways. Men are reprimanded or worse, fired and prosecuted if a woman is offended by an action or a comment. How can a company operate efficiently if they place harmony above everything else? They don't. It seems to be now in this modern age, any sphere in society, whether it be the workplace or something else, will always elevate the gynocentric social order over all else, particularly men. This is especially true when a woman seems to have been injured or offended by the actions or words of a man. Lastly, when women entered the primarily male workspaces, as with any male space, it changed the dynamic within it. Rollo Tomassi encompassed it best in regards to women entering the exclusively male space. When the influence of feminine primacy is introduced into social settings made up mainly by men and male interests, the dynamics and purpose of that group changes. The purpose becomes less about the endeavor itself and more about adherence to the feminine inclusionary aspect of that endeavor. It starts to become less about being the best or most passionate at what they do and more about being acceptable to the influence of the feminine imperative while maintaining the former level of interest in the endeavor. Once the feminine primary in-group dynamic is established, a feminine correct social frame follows. This feminine correction restructures the priorities of goals and validates any accomplishments in terms of how they reflect upon the feminine as a whole. Thus, any in-group success is perceived as a feminine success in male space, while in-group failures or simple mediocrity is either dismissed entirely or blamed on out-group male failures to comply with or the rejection of the feminine imperative's correcting influence on the in-group. It becomes less about the work and more about the feminine. This is like when male managers capitulate to women's needs and demands, even when it compromises the primary goal of why they are there in the first place, to work. Women work less than men. This is obvious. Even if we didn't have the data to support this, it is so easy to notice if you worked any kind of job that had women working there. It is a scientific fact that women are more agreeable and less assertive. Also, women lack in the idea facet of the openness trait, but score higher than men on the feelings facet. These traits that women possess are not favorable in a highly competitive, stressful, and results-oriented workplace. Many times in my working career have I seen women complain to their managers about their menstrual cramps, a minor illness, or their children's school being canceled, and the managers 100% of the time allow them to leave for the day. This is not conducive to building an efficient and work-oriented culture in any workplace. There is still so much more to say on this topic, such as women bemoaning because the air conditioning in an office is sexist, or companies offering egg freezing as a company perk, or the fact that women increase healthcare costs for employees and employers exponentially. Ultimately, the workplace is no longer about coming to work and getting the job done. Since women's arrival, society has made drastic changes to ensure that the weaker sex is afforded special privileges and perks. The workplace has become female-centric. Men can no longer be men. They must be careful not to say or do something which can be deemed inappropriate or wrong by their female colleagues. They can no longer earn the wages that they deserve. They can no longer provide for themselves. It is only going to become worse and worse until the economy finally topples in on itself and women start getting a dose of reality.